Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Kevin Igoe, Managing Director of Professional Fee Protection. I'm pleased to welcome you all here today, and in particular to introduce Chris Gargan of HMRC. And what we're going to be discussing today, and Chris is going to be discussing today, is of course the area of statutory reviews and how these work and where we're going with these. So they are an important area of the tax regime and dealing with HMRC, and it's one that we do need to be familiar with. So without further ado, Chris, if I could just ask you to introduce yourself, say hello, and a little bit about your background.
Hi. Yes, hi, thank you very much. Thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. Yeah, my name's Chris Gargan. I'm the Assistant Director for the National Statutory Review Team. I've worked in HMRC for more years than any sensible person probably would. But I suppose more interestingly, I suppose, for this purpose is I've been involved in the appeal and review environment since 2008. So I was around for the time of the tribunal reforms and the projects that actually assessed the impact of those reforms. And I've been involved in the appeal and review environment ever since, really. So I've now got the National Statutory Review Team, and we have operational responsibility for all statutory reviews on behalf of HMRC. So that's I suppose, our rather narrow world of interest, albeit with the full range of duty heads that we administer. It is actually quite an interesting role. What I'd like to do today is talk to you a little bit about stat review in general, a bit of background about its introduction, what it entails. What do we actually do? The relationship we have with the wider HMRC business, how we interact with them. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, as Kevin mentioned, the future look. Where do we see statutory review going, and how that would then play out and impact, hopefully, with the customer base who we interact with.
Great, thanks very much. So I should add before Chris starts, as usual, we're happy to take questions throughout if you put them in the question box in the usual manner. Chris has said to me that he's happy to take the more difficult questions, the more difficult the better. So please feel free to wade in on that basis. So without further ado, Chris, back over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to turn my camera off now, so you're not actually subjected to this for the duration, so we can actually concentrate on the slides if that's okay. So if we can move on to the next slide, Kevin, please. The purpose of this slide really is just to give you a visual, if you like, of the place the statutory review team and indeed the appeals teams have within HMRC. You will see, and whilst the visual is not to scale, we sit completely separately from the decision-making business of the customer compliance group and the customer service group areas. Our area is organised functionally, so we have a national statutory review team on the left. We have national litigation, account avoidance, benefits credits, all the various arms of the legal operations function that sits within the SOLS business area. That separation is important, of course, as from our perspective, that seeks to demonstrate our impartiality when we're looking at review requests from customers. We're organised on a functional basis. So just looking down the left-hand side, we have a direct tax review team. We have a VAT review team. We have a team that looks specifically at excise cases, separate team for customs cases, separate team for hardship cases, and so on. Each of these teams is supported by the technical team that sit within, again, the technical teams group. Here we have technicians who will provide technical advice, perhaps unsurprisingly, to the reviewers, but that team also countersigns everything that we do. All the reviews that are undertaken of substantive cases are countersigned by the technical team. So we have an assurance, inbuilt assurance, that as far as we possibly can as human beings, we are getting the right answer. So it is a genuine, fresh look at the decision that's in dispute. We also have the late penalties team. And again, perhaps unsurprisingly, this team will consider all review requests arising from late penalties, be they filing, be they payment, be they direct tax, be they indirect taxes. all of the regimes are actually addressed in this team. The consideration here is principally reasonable excuse. So that's our structure, and that's how we line up. And as I say, we have that physical separation between ourselves and the rest of the HMRC business. We have an outreach team as well, which again I'll talk about as we get into the slides, because they actually are an important part now of our just our efforts to help the compliance business to get things right and to improve the standard of decision making. But I won't get into that now. I'll come back to that in a little more detail as we get going.
Okay, so we have an early question from Peter. So Peter's asked, so the map points out that you're separate, but how can you be separate or independent when you're all part of the same HMRC?
You know, I do understand that, and I think that is a question that is something that we have encountered on a number of occasions over the years. Up to 2016, the appeal and review teams actually sat within the local compliance business area. So I think I can understand at that juncture that, you know, there was common management of and common leadership of the reviews and appeals teams as well as the decision-making teams. Since 2016, we've actually sat completely separately within SOLS, the Solicitor's Office and Legal Services area. SOLS, as I'm sure the majority of the participants will realise, is an influential part of HMRC, which influences rather than is necessarily influenced by the decision-making team. So I think that, you know, our place is genuinely as a separate function, and as we'll come on to talk about when I'm talking about the kind of things that the outreach team are doing, I think it will be clear that we are the ones exerting the influence rather than being directed by the decision-making teams. So I think we have as well as a physical separation, I think it's clear from the way that the functions now operate that you know, it is genuinely a best effort at an impartial, fresh pair of eyes, and that is hopefully a reassurance, I think, for people about our independence.
Great, thanks.
So we'll move on to the next slide. Just to give some context here about reviews and the extent of reviews. So in any given year, I'm sure you'll again know that HMRC will complete hundreds of thousands of compliance checks. So we're talking here principally about substantive decisions rather than the late penalties arena, where the undertaking is quite different. So only a very small proportion of these compliance checks are ever actually disputed. So only very small numbers comparatively end up in the review arena. Now, on ordinary years, 2,000, 2,400 direct tax, similar numbers for VAT, much less for excise, much less for customs, and a few niche areas around as well where we may see a few. The 2 years that I'm going to show you some data on a little bit later on, slightly out of line, but there are exceptional circumstances which I will explain as well when we get to them. But ordinarily, not huge numbers, 1%, perhaps 2% in some of the regimes, if that. From our perspective, we see reviews as being a quick, easy, cheap way for the customer to ask HMRC to have Stat review process was introduced in 2009, as I've mentioned in the tribunal reforms. Stat review replaced what was the reconsideration process in VAT and indirect taxes generally, and was a new concept for direct taxes. The appeal to tribunal was also introduced at this point in time, replacing the General Special Commissioner's approach for direct taxes, but following what was the indirect tax approach. So we have 45 days provided in statute to conduct the review, but but we can agree a longer period. We can agree an extension, but only with agreement by the customer. The customer can, of course, bypass the review and go straight to tribunal. And the review is available in almost all appealable decisions. I hope nobody puts me to challenge on that, because for the last week we've been trying to find one that doesn't have the right of review, and unfortunately I've failed miserably. Are we okay to move on, Kevin, or are there?
We have a couple of, we have a few questions on this one. Tom says, having never been to independent review, he's always wondered what was the point, is if it's the same information being digested by HMRC, what is the basis for ever making a different decision?
Okay, well, when we actually get on to the next slide, when we talk about what we do, it actually talks about the checks that we will apply in terms of the review that we conduct. And so there are the various stages that we will go through. And yes, it will ostensibly be about the same information, but there is the opportunity for the customer to make representations when requesting the review or accepting the offer of review. So if there is new information, this is the opportunity for it to be brought forward. Surprisingly, a significant proportion of the cases that we see where we do vary or cancel the case, it has been as a result of new information. But when we get to the next slide as well, and I talk about the steps that we take about making sure we're legally correct and we have an evidential base, I'll perhaps explain a little bit more about the reasons why we cancel a review.
Okay, another question from Sharon about the 45-day period. You mentioned by agreement. What if we don't get an agreement?
Okay.
Is that fair? Because she understands HMRC rules, as it were.
Yeah, well, indeed, and there's the legislation there. I believe it was intended as effectively a full stop, so that HMRC and the customer had certainty. Well, this was the intention in 2009. Whether that actually is how it's played out is another story, I guess. But with 45 days or such time as should be agreed, if we're outside the 45 days and no agreement for an extension has actually been secured, and we haven't actually conducted the review, then the decision is deemed upheld in HMRC's favour, which I do understand. There does seem to be an inherent unfairness in that, perhaps. The protection for the customer there, though, is that they do have the right of appeal to tribunal. So, it's hopefully, and we see this in the vast majority of cases, we are able to agree extensions and we do settle on a reasonable period, so there isn't unnecessary delay. From a management perspective, I think it's probably fair to say that we view a deemed decision as a failure, and we have so very few. We have maybe one or two a year, and sometimes for situations which are perhaps outside of the control of the review environment. But so it is extremely rare that we will actually find ourselves in that territory.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm getting a number of questions here, and this will be addressed to our listeners about the proportion of overturned reviews and whatever. So I'll hold fire on those questions for now. That is something that Chris is going to cover on later slides. Fires has asked, how qualified are the officers in the review team?
Yeah, okay. Everybody in the review team is technically trained. So we have, be that from the grade 7s who've been through what's now our TSP. For those on the call who are ex-revenue, it's the old FT2 or the new version of the FT2. We have our own routeway programs. So everybody coming into the review environment will have technical training appropriate for the level of technical requirement of the cases that they're considering. So we have a professional outfit who are not only technically trained themselves, but they are then also supported by a higher grade technical expert, if I can call it that, who will again have a further look and assure the judgments that are being reached. So we're quite well equipped, I think I would say.
Do you ever use any external consultants?
External to HMRC, no.
Yes.
We would definitely not. That was the easiest question of the day so far, Kevin.
Yeah, yes. Well, Martin's asked, is asking for a higher level review still available first?
A higher level review?
So if they're in dispute and they're with an individual inspector dealing with the case or officer, can they still ask for a senior officer to review it first rather than going straight to a statutory review?
I think that would be a decision within the decision-making team, so part of the CCG compliance teams. I think it's always, well, I've worked in that environment. I've led teams, compliance intervention teams, and if it were ever requested by an agent, accountant, representative that somebody more senior looked at the case, we would always accede to that request. Unless it was a repeated request and it was seemingly there was a pattern or it was perceived as being unreasonable to do so. I can't see any circumstances which would say no. I would think it always makes sense to try and find a way through inquiry cases without us getting into dispute.
Thank you. Fires ask about the timeline, the 45 days. With the large delays really everywhere due to COVID, is this being extended?
Yeah, well, I think what we've seen for the review and appeal environments is that we actually introduced an easement. So customers had an extra 90 days, basically, in which to either lodge their appeal to HMRC, their appeal to their review request to HMRC, or indeed to receive their review conclusions from HMRC having requested a review. So there was an inbuilt facility to try and offer some sort of relaxation, if that's the right expression, or some consideration for the customers for the potential difficulties they were facing as part of the COVID pandemic. We are now looking at actually whether those easements are still appropriate, given that the stage that we're now at in the pandemic, but no decision has been made yet as to when they should be removed. So they remain in place.
Okay, thank you. Another one from Martin here, a different Martin. Do you need to have an appealable decision in order to ask for a statutory review, or can you ask for a statutory review about the behaviour or response of a particular inspector on a particular item?
Yeah, well, the stat review is basically a right conveyed following the receipt of an appealable decision. So yes, there has to be a review. If the concern is about behaviour and about conduct or the way a case has been managed, then the complaint group is the appropriate avenue for that.
Okay, thank you. Lastly, before we move on, from Sabir asks about, again, back to this statutory period. How does this timeline fit in with ADR?
Again, ADR is something which is available, and I think again the further relaxations around ADR now. ADR is available pretty much right up until the tribunal steps. So if a case was to go into ADR, I think, just reminding myself now, I think for an ADR there has to be an appeal to tribunal, or that was the consideration.
Well, no, there doesn't at the moment. I think there needs to be, if an assessment has been issued, it needs to be appealed against before ADR will listen to it, deal with it. So I think, Sabir, I think that following your question, I think that's right. The timeline isn't really affected as such because you need to appeal against it in any way within the appeals deadline, and then the statutory review body will take on that after the appeal has been made or after the assessment's been issued. So it won't affect the timeline, but you need to make the appeal.
No, it wouldn't. But equally, in our review conclusion letters, we will actually point customers towards ADR in appropriate cases.
Yeah. Okay, great stuff. Well, thank you very much. Let's move on the slide.
Okay, so what do we do in review? First step is have we actually got legislative cover for what we're doing? Have we used the right legislation? If not, then we've got a problem and we wouldn't be going any further. Is it technically correct, procedurally correct? Have we followed our own guidance? And one of the fundamentals here as well is it evidentially sound? Have we actually got an evidence base for the decision that we've reached? So these, when the question before asked, well, what's the point of actually considering a review when it's based on the same information that had been seen by the decision maker? These things would not necessarily have been considered to the extent that we will look at them by the decision maker. Essentially, when we're conducting a statutory review, what I suggest to the team is the shoes they need to stand in is, would we be prepared to defend this case if it went to tribunal? Would we actually go to court on it? And if it's not evidentially sound and it isn't legally correct, then we certainly won't be. So, you know, I think there's clear merit in having the review. Internally, you know, we obviously, HMRC will have a policy position on things. And so we would always look to see if we're in line with current policy and practice. Is the decision in line with the litigation and settlement strategy? So we have all of these considerations then before we actually reach our conclusions. We would notify our conclusions to the customer in writing, and we would copy in their representatives where we had authority to do so. And we will uphold, we will vary, or we will cancel the decision as appropriate. And as again, we've kind of trailed earlier on, we will come back to some statistics just to give you a flavour of how that looks in 2 given years. The customers then got 30 days in which to decide what to do. So they can either accept the review conclusion, and our own data suggests to us that 75% of those who have a statutory review, in fact it's in excess of 75% currently, don't then appeal. Or the customer can then go on and notify their appeal to the tribunal. So, stat review is actually an effective vehicle for resolving disputes, certainly from our perspective. Should we move on?
Alex, yeah, Alex has asked a quick question. Well, sorry, a quick question. A question about, you mentioned evidentially sound. Your cases are reviewed that they are evidentially sound. Why is it we see so many tax cases where they're thrown out because there wasn't evidence there?
Well, I think, I know that there's been a recent case that's actually attracted some publicity, and one of the things is best judgment. I think the consideration was best judgment in that particular case. The judiciary are obviously at liberty to reach their own conclusions, and you know, if they see things through a different lens, or they don't give appropriate or the same weight as we have given to the evidence that we were able to present, then you know, that's their prerogative. Similarly, you know, if we haven't presented our evidence as well as we may, which again can possibly happen, that will also affect the tribunal and their judgment. We do find that the judiciary are often quite critical of HMRC in their commentary, and sometimes they will focus on one particular element of a case, and that then attracts the headline. HMRC's success rate actually in tribunal is about 85–86%, and HMRC's success rate in settling appeals in HMRC's favour outside of tribunal again is in excess of 80%. So the instances where we are getting it wrong, you know, are not as they're not as great as you may think by the judicial commentary that attracts that negative press.
Okay, I just have a comment here, so there's no need to comment, but Sean has made the comment, in his opinion, the litigation and settlement strategy is outdated and the biggest obstacle to settlements. Is it not about time this was reviewed to revisit its application? So I won't ask you to comment on that, but I just there.
You won't get disagreement from me either, though.
Yeah, Jira has asked, can we have both review, statutory review, and ADR?
Yes, indeed. Once we've done a review, if we're upholding or varying, then you know, we will suggest that, you know, in the majority of cases, then we will suggest that ADR may be a consideration.
Is materiality ever a consideration? I.e., do you ever say, well, that's too small, let's just leave it?
No.
No.
No. Basically, it's got to be on its merits. And you think, I do understand materiality is a consideration, and you know, at some point, should you look and say, well, actually, do we actually want to go to tribunal on a £100 penalty? But there's the integrity of the system, the deterrent effect. There'd be a lot of considerations before we would walk away from something, and materiality wouldn't be the only one.
Okay. Keith has made the point, the success rate of 75 and 85% that aren't appealed doesn't mean they're necessarily correct. It's just that it's not cost effective from the customers or the taxpayers' perspective. Okay, if we can move on now, because I know we've got a lot of questions coming in and we've got quite a lot of material to get through. Yeah. So yeah, thanks. But keep the questions coming in and we will get back to them as we go later.
Okay. Yeah. Well, actually, I won't necessarily, the next two slides I won't get into in that great detail then, because I think people will want to get into or have some discussion about the data. And I particularly want to talk to you a little bit about the way forward as well. But what we do strive for within the department is effectively a learning culture. So we look for lessons learned and we play these back to the decision-making business. All completed reviews go back to the decision maker and their manager. So that's the review conclusion template that we complete, as well as the letter. We give additional feedback as appropriate. We provide statistical information to the actual line of business, as well as to the directorates on a quarterly basis. And as I've mentioned, the outreach team that I commented on in the opening slide, they will then work with the business looking at themes within the conclusions that we've reached on appeals and within the review environment, and they will play them back to the quality teams and see what we can do to help them to actually get things right. Taking that one step further, our outreach teams have actually developed something called Compliance Plus, which is an e-learning product which walks new trainees as well as existing compliance caseworkers through the building blocks of how to work a compliance check and the necessary things that need to be present for their compliance check to stand up at review. So hopefully improve the quality of the decision making along the way. So if we just move on to the next slide, so we maybe save ourselves a little bit of time. The ambition here is that we will go further with that and continue to develop the Compliance Plus products. Building those links with the compliance groups, professionalism teams. So we are actually working with them to help them in improving decision making. And we're also strengthening our leads with the policy colleagues across the various regimes, direct and indirect, so that we have the most up-to-date policy perspective when we're actually making decisions ourselves. It's not just external to ourselves that we obviously recognise we need to learn and improve and constantly evolve. So we've developed something called operational guidance notes, where we see a new concept that we've not encountered before, or indeed an old long-standing area that's causing us some difficulty. We will develop an operational guidance note which will seek to give the reviewer some support material to help them in considering the particular circumstances of the case that they're looking at. Okay. And I have mentioned as well that I would like to go on to talk a little bit about this project that we've commissioned to look up the take-up of the offer of review, which kind of is a neat segue into the data as well, actually. So if we want to go on to the next slide, Kevin, here's some numbers. Now, the 2 years that we've got, are kind of exceptional for different reasons, radically different reasons, as I'm sure you're all acutely aware. 2019-20, we saw an avoidance scheme landed within the review environment. A lot of VAT decisions, a lot of direct tax decisions, high numbers of cancellations, reissues, etc. So 19-20 is not a typical year for that reason alone. 2021 isn't typical of anything I've ever seen in my lifetime for reasons I'm sure you're all acutely aware of. What we normally see on a given year, 2,000, 2,400 direct tax, 2,000, 2,400 VAT. The numbers around customs and excise, probably not hugely different to the numbers represented in the charts here. The late penalties, VAT late penalties and the direct tax late penalties, there was a pause on the penalties in 2021, so the numbers there are quite different. 1920, broadly in line with what we've been seeing for some time historically. The number for reviews, core reviews, substantive reviews, has basically flatlined since about 2009 when reviews were introduced. That in itself is one of the reasons why we've actually commissioned this project, to look at the reasons for that. Having been involved at the outset, this review to me seemed like a free shot. You know, why wouldn't you? Yes, I understand the point about, you know, marking your own homework. I kind of get that. But why wouldn't you? And then the vast majority didn't. 2/3 of those who appeal directly to tribunal without having a review. So I'll come back to that theme a little bit when we start talking about the project. So whilst the numbers I'm showing you here aren't typical, if we move on to the next slide, I think the purpose of the data really is just to reinforce the point about the cancellations. If a decision needs cancelling, it is cancelled. I think the cancellation rates here are high. I think for, well, certainly in 1920, the avoidance scheme that landed in our business area spiked the cancellation rates. And I think 2021 has been exceptional for us in many ways, and the cancellation rate is higher than we have normally seen. Across the two principal regimes, direct tax and VAT, the rule of thumb I've kind of adopted over time is about 70% upheld, 20% varied, 10% cancelled. So we're slightly out of kilter, but I think my purpose in showing you this is that, you know, basically the reassurance, if it needs cancelling, it will be. So those are the ratios for VAT. The next slide that we have is the customs and excise review arena, not radically different from the VAT. Again, I think ballpark, that's not far off what we would expect as being a normal year. And for direct taxes, again, if we move on to the next one, these again were skewed by the avoidance scheme in 2019-20, but 2021 is more in line with the kind of ratios we would normally see. But I would say again there, the numbers of reviews that have been completed are much reduced because of effectively the pause on compliance activity. Okay, so they're the three slides in respect of the substantive work areas. The next two slides are the late penalty regimes. So for the default surcharge review, in DS, the review is the first time a human being looks at the case. So in 1920, I said the numbers that we actually saw were probably not massively out from what we've seen previously. And the ratios here are probably about what we would normally expect to see. In 2021, the COVID year, reasonable excuse, COVID was accepted as a reasonable excuse. So the cancellation rate is much higher in that year. And that's the pattern again in the current year. We are seeing a very high cancellation rate in the default surcharge regime. And the last slide is the direct tax late penalties. The initial appeal in direct tax cases is to HMRC. So the initial consideration of this will have already been undertaken before the statutory review is received by us in Sols. So again, these cancellation rates, certainly 1920, broadly in line. 2021 is probably slightly higher, I think in part again because of the consideration for reasonable excuse of COVID. Yeah, quite an unusual year. So that's the data. And again, I think the point there was really just to show it is a genuine fresh pair of eyes, and it is an attempt to get to the right answer. And we don't want cases progressing to tribunal if we can resolve the issue earlier in the process.
Okay, I'll ask one question from Paul before we go on here. He makes a comment on the direct review slide. With only 9% of appeals, if you like, or requests being upheld, is it worth appealing at all, or is it worth going to statutory review at all?
Only 9% were cancelled in 2021. Is that the point?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, 13% of them were varied. Ordinarily, in a given year, there's probably 10% cancellation, 20% varied.
Yeah.
It is. I think it's almost a 1 in 3 shot of something in your favour. Well, I suppose I can't say any more than that really. If we were cancelling a lot more decisions on an ordinary year, I think that would give us as a department, much more great cause for concern about the quality of the decision making.
Okay. I think I'll jump the gun on questions I'm going to get there, Chris, and say that 1 in 3 shot, 9 and 13 adds up to 22. But there we go.
Yeah, but sorry, I think the point I was making was in an ordinary year. Now, the years I'm showing you are unfortunately slightly out of kilter. But if we actually, the rule of thumb, 70% upheld. This is my rule of thumb, I would say. 70% upheld, 20% varied, 10% cancellations is, it's not far off a 1 in 3. I'll quit while I'm ahead, or I think I'm ahead. Okay, so we just turn now to look a little bit to the future. Okay, now I've mentioned when we were talking about the data that the number of reviews has basically flatlined since it was introduced. So free shot, why wouldn't you? Reviews were actually of interest in the last couple of years. It was 2018, actually the OTS, the Office of Tax Simplification, and the House of Lords Finance Committee both looked at stat review as a concept. In essence, the summation of the findings of both of the bodies was reviews are a good thing. You should do more, but you need to advertise it better. So taking those concepts on board, as well as then the anecdotal information feedback that we've had from other parties as well, we commissioned a project to explore the reasons behind the low uptake and again why 2/3 of appellants go straight to tribunal without having a review. So if we move on to the next slide, the project in essence, starting with the 2/3 of appellants without not you having a review, the lack of awareness, our own data tells us that basically 75% of reviews don't then go on to appeal. I understand the point about there being a cost effective not to do so. The need for us to understand customer behaviour, though, I think was quite important. So we commissioned some external research conducted by Ipsos Mori, which again I'll come on and talk to in a moment's time. But the aspiration for us here was that we actually improved the customer's lot. If we could actually explain review better, it would hopefully increase the uptake of review. If we increase the uptake of review, we reduce the number of appeals going into compliance. And again, there's a benefit for HMRC as well, because it's more cost effective for us to conduct a review than it is for us to conduct litigation as well. So cost effectiveness is a consideration for us as well. Okay, so what have we been up to? If we move on to the next slide, the project has actually looked internally. We've spoken to the compliance teams as well about their understanding of review, the interaction with them, how we could improve it for them. But we've also spoken to the BT&C, business tax, debt management, PT operations, about their guidance, their call scripts, their understanding of review. If our call handlers actually understand review and can explain review appropriately to customers when they need to do so, then that is obviously in the customer's best interests, or hopefully in their interests. We've, as part of the project, because of the interest the Office of Tax Simplification had shown in our work, we've invited them into the project, and they've actually participated in capacity as a critical friend, and they've been invaluable really from the outset. And we've also got policy colleagues involved working with us. Jumping down the slide, I mentioned the Ipsos Mori consultation. In addition to asking Ipsos Mori to undertake work, well, basically consulting with people who have chosen to go directly to tribunal without a review, we also liaise with a number of the professional bodies. We obviously will have people on the call today who are members of either AAT, ATT, COP, ICAS, UK 200. We've spoken to groups from each of these bodies, and we've also spoken to Litrig. Now, Litrig was slightly different in that, you know, our interest there was their web page is visited up to 4 million times a year by the unrepresented. So they're reaching a community that we're probably not. So actually having a view from them was actually quite important for us as well. But the findings from both effectively mirror each other. There's a lack of awareness about reviews. People didn't know what it was, and these were within the professional bodies as well. There's confusion caused by our post signposting, the decision notices, offering review, the fact the customer has to go back to the decision maker to ask for the review. The customers thought that was the review. They didn't realise then it went somewhere else. So they get the view of the matter and they think that was their shot. And it all was just a bit unsatisfactory, really. So we've been looking at how we're signposting review, looking at the decision notices that we issue. So we're looking at the wording, how we explain the offer. HMRC1 is the principal information leaflet that goes with decisions. I read it and I didn't understand it, and that was a bit worrying, really. Not because I'm not that bright, but equally, it was just confusing. So we needed to replace and improve basically what we were doing. HMRC1 is going to be replaced completely with a new product. We're working with the CDIO to actually sort out the content of that so it's clearer. We're working with the GDS, Government Design Service, looking at the gov.uk content as well. And the majority of that has now been changed, and it will further evolve as the HMRC1 or its replacement is actually developed. And the wording on decision letters will also then follow, so that we hopefully not only better explain the review offer in the decision, the accompanying guidance material is much clearer. And if people need to go to gov.uk, they can actually be clearly walked through what they need to do if they want to have a review. We're also looking at the digital option, and here is whether or not we can actually have an online portal for review requests. Now, this will be linked to the personal tax account, so it is some way down the track. But that would then take away another one of the elements of this independence argument. Rather than actually asking the decision maker for the review, they would be asking us directly. So it would be coming to a separate part of the business completely, and it would be apparent that it was doing so. So hopefully, again, that will be another step forward for us in promoting the concept of review as an impartial, fresh pair of eyes. So if we move on to the next slide, the majority of the work that we've been doing is, let's call it discovery, if you like. We've about concluded now. The Ipsos Mori report is being signed off, probably as we speak, and will be published on gov.uk in the next few weeks. So if anybody was actually interested to see what was being said, it will be available. So the next things for us now are securing the remaining changes to gov.uk, securing the improvements to HMRC1, its successor basically, and what that will look like, and making sure all decision letters that go out actually explain the offer of statutory review appropriately and clearly, so that the customer can see that there is an option there that they've not necessarily explored. From our perspective then, you know, how will we measure whether or not we've had the influence that we were? Will we've changed behaviour, whether we've influenced the customers in the way that we hoped? So we'll have a period now where we look at the impact of those changes once they've landed. And hopefully we will see a switch in that community. The 66% who currently appeal direct to tribunal will hopefully have review first. That will then in turn hopefully reduce the number who then onward appeal. there are a range of various options around that as to what might actually happen. So we have a period of watching now to see which way the customers go, basically. So we'll be looking at the data over the next months, 6-12 months, and see just how that actually pans out. And then, we'll have further considerations as to whether or not more needs to be done to promote review as a concept. Okay. The benefits for us in this, if we've actually got a better explained offer, we're explaining to the customers, what review is about, and we can actually make the case that it is actually this genuine, fresh pair of eyes, giving a fresh look at their decision. Hopefully, we will see an increase in reviews, and that in turn will hopefully give us an increased customer satisfaction with HMRC. The cost reduction, I think I'm probably fair to say from a customer's perspective as well. I do appreciate PFP customers might not necessarily bear the cost personally, but it's costly for the customer, the agent. It's costly for HMRC to have to go to tribunal. There's a huge amount of work in preparing for a hearing. If we can avoid that, then that's got to be in everybody's interests. Similarly, if the proportion of reviews that then are not onward appealed continues, or indeed increases, as I say, it's over 80% currently, that's better news for the Exchequer, because I appreciate VAT has to be paid unless there's hardship before an appeal can progress. Direct taxes, that's not the case. Tax is postponed. The duties will become due and payable to the Exchequer within 30 days of the review conclusion. So it does accelerate revenue to the Exchequer. I've mentioned the point about the cost savings for HMRC one. It costs us an average of £5,000 to conduct an appeal. A review costs us about £1,200, as an average. So if we actually achieve that switch or that change of behaviour, then there's almost £4,000 a case saving for HMRC. And looking outside of the department as well, just one final point is, the tribunal service is under considerable pressure, exacerbated, I think, by the fact that they had to close for the period of the pandemic. They are getting back to some sort of normality with video hearings and telephone hearings, but it's going to take some time to turn that round. And I think even pre-pandemic, having the standard case heard, there was a considerable time lag between the appeal being lodged and the dates of the hearing. If we can take appeals out of that environment, that eases pressure within the tribunal service, and it will also mean that customers can hopefully have their appeals heard more quickly, which again, removing the stress of an ongoing dispute, I say it is quite, I've not actually been in that situation, but I can only imagine that that's got to be beneficial too. Now my jaw's aching now, so I'm probably going to shut up, Kevin, but that about concludes.
Okay. Well, give yourself 3 seconds whilst I ask the next question. Okay, thanks for that. If anybody has any comments or questions on this future and the project, please send them in as well. Question by Peter, do you know how many of your decisions are overturned by a tribunal? Do you keep those stats?
We do, and it's very few. I don't have them off the top of my head, but what I can do is let Kevin have them. And I think that the number of cases where a review is undertaken and the appeal is then either pulled by the litigation teams for some reason, or doesn't progress, or is lost in the courts, is minimal. We're talking penny numbers, but I think it's a good question, so I will certainly dig out the data and I'll let you know some numbers.
Okay, thank you. Paul asks, he had a case where the inspector stopped sending letters to us as agent all of a sudden and then dealt with the client direct. The client was not aware of this and actually completed the inquiry without our intervention, and no offer was made of either ADR or review. So I guess that's a comment.
Well, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that's not clever, but I don't want to go any further than that.
Yeah. Does the solicitor's office tail sometimes wag the technical HMRC dog? Sometimes it feels as if inspectors and solicitors are out of kilter, and once in the hands of the lawyers, there's no way back.
Well, none of my team are lawyers, so that's my get out. I think, you know, there has to be, I suppose, a recognition that once something is in the hands of the lawyers, you know, basically they are the people who are effectively the guardians of the legislation, if I could put it like that. So, you know, if the lawyers are handling a case, then it is for good reason. I don't know about the tail wagging the dog. I think, you know, it's fair to say sols are an extremely influential part of the business, but in most cases, I think rightly so.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, somebody's made a comment here. I'll just paraphrase it, or a question. Isn't the fact that solicitor's office overturns the statutory review suggesting that the decision was potentially wrong?
I'm sorry, is that kind of on the same theme as the first question?
Yes. It's just a comment. Yeah.
Well, again, I think the occasions when it happens, and again, I would actually just add there that a number of instances where that happened is where we receive new information. So, you know, I think that there's an obligation here for all of us to make sure that, you know, all of the information that's going to actually help resolve the dispute is in play at the earliest opportunity. But yeah, I mean, we're human beings. I know it's a strange concept with working for HMRC, but, you know, humans can make a mistake. You know, we're not perfect, but we make every human effort to make sure that we do get it right. There will always be occasions, and hopefully they're rare, when that doesn't actually work and we do get things wrong, but, you know, it is rare.
Okay, thank you. How do we know the review has been conducted by the review team and not simply by another person in the decision-making team?
Yeah, well, that's a good point as well. If it's been reviewed by the reviews team in SOLS, it will come out on SOLS note paper. It will have a SOLS letterhead, and it will be a review officer from the statutory review team who has conducted the review. So it will be plain from the letter whether it's come from the business or whether it's come from us. If it's come from the business, I would be very grateful if you would send it to me.
Okay. Is the inquiry process following assessment, e.g. review and ADR process and timing, found anywhere in HMRC's manual or leaflet?
Oh, good question. Was that the review process or?
Sorry, well, the question is the inquiry process
right
following assessment, e.g. review and ADR process and timing, found anywhere in HMRC's manual or leaflet?
Yeah, but I must admit, it's about 12 years since I worked in the compliance teams, but my understanding was that the inquiry process was actually outlined there. And, you know, HMRC will give notice of inquiry and, you know, then, yeah, so the process should be outlined somewhere, yes. Well, I can't say for definite, Kevin. I'm off the top of my head there, but I would be surprised if it was.
Well, I think it's in the letters, in fairness, that the stuff that comes with the assessment, it does say in the backing paper there that you can go to review or you can have ADR or whatever. You know, it is in the inquiry manual, Sabir, but it's also outlined in the letters that accompany each assessment or decision that you have the right of appeal and ADR and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Paul has asked, I'm not sure what you're going to answer to this one, but how does the revenue view PFP customers?
Well, to be fair, I mean, the PFP it's an option for the customer, isn't it? It's an understandable consideration for people. I'm not actually advertising on Kevin's behalf here, but for me, you know, well, again, my brother's a surgeon, a consultant in the NHS. And his accountant very early on recommended that he took insurance. And when he actually had an inquiry with HMRC, it turned out to be, and again, this isn't a plug, and this isn't something I've agreed with Kevin previously, but it was the best money he'd ever spent. You know, and from the revenue perspective, you know, it's not a judgment for us to exercise, really.
Thank you. Oh, that was a very loaded question. Okay, well, thank you for that. We will be sending a copy of the slides out after this with Chris's contact details. He's kindly put them on the screen for everybody. So if anybody has any questions following this, you know where to go. But Chris, I would like to thank you for coming along today and giving a quite comprehensive webinar for us, and certainly not ducking any questions that you got. So thank you very much. Before we go, can I do my usual monthly plug for our tax investigations conference coming up on the 4th, 7th of October even, the online event. You can see there this year from HMRC we have a panel of speakers, including Janet Alexander, who's the, how can I define it, the head of COVID from HMRC, together with representatives from FIS, Fraud Investigation Service, the ADR, Jim Benson, of course, and also some normal tax inspectors, if there is such a thing, they're normal tax inspectors. So that you're going to have a chance to quiz them. They'll do a presentation, you'll be able to ask them questions for a good hour or so, hour and a quarter. So, as well as some other great speakers there you can see on the screen. So please, if you're interested in that, please do sign up and we'd be delighted to see you.
Okay. Can I just say thank you, Kevin, to you for facilitating this and for inviting me in the first place. And thank you, everybody, for the questions. Kevin did say to me it will be one of the fastest hours of your life, and yes, it was about right with that. But thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you, and thank you for your engagement. It's appreciated.
Thank you very much, Chris. We will be having another webinar next month. I believe it's on trusts. My memory fails me, but you know, we'll be sending out the usual email. So thanks again, and hope to speak to you soon.